Last Thanksgiving, I was visiting family out of town, a trip I make every year. My parents still live in the house that I grew up in, but I moved out over 10 years ago. My town was about a 4-hour drive away with good traffic. I left my family's place in the late afternoon, expecting to hit the evening rush, but, as luck would have it, the city's roads were clogged with vehicles. By the time I hit the highway leading to my town, it was already dark. By then, traffic was sparse on the highway. It was a relief compared to the stop-and-go traffic leading out of the city. I live in a smaller town than my parents, so the highway I take is not as busy. It was almost empty for most of my trip, save for the few occasional cars that zoomed past. When I was about an hour and a half from home, I noticed a truck behind me. It was a dark pickup, and it looked newer. It was following me a bit too closely. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking the driver would eventually pass, but he didn't. Instead, he seemed to be deliberately tailgating me. His headlights were glaring in my rearview mirror. This truck had intensely bright lights. I almost thought he had his high beams on. Not quite, but almost. We continued on like that for a few minutes. I was watching my rearview mirror, hoping he would back off or pass me, but that didn't happen. Eventually, he switched on his brights. The intense light blinded me, making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. I felt a surge of fear because I thought I was going to crash. I had no idea who this person was or what he wanted. To avoid any trouble, I decided to pull over and let him pass. There really wasn't anything I could do other than that. It was so bright. I eased my car onto the shoulder of the road, expecting the truck to continue on its way. Instead, it pulled over, stopping right behind me. I saw a man get out of the truck. He was large, but I couldn't tell much else. If I had any sense, I would have driven away, but I was still trying to let my eyes adjust to the light, and I didn't think I could see properly. As he started walking towards my car, every instinct in me screamed that he was bad news. I remembered the pistol I legally carried for protection. I'd never used it before, not outside of a shooting range, but as the man got closer, I felt compelled to take it out of the glove compartment. I hoped just having it out would be enough to scare him off. The man reached my car and started banging on the window, yelling something incoherent. His face was red with anger, but I still don't know why. I held the pistol out of sight, but within easy reach. I hoped he would just leave, but he didn't. That's when things took a turn for the worse. In a quick movement, the man pulled out a gun of his own. The situation was spiraling out of control, and I had no idea how it would end. I had to make a split-second decision. As he raised his gun towards me, I fired a single shot through my window. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in my car. I couldn't tell if the bullet had hit him, but he staggered back. Seizing the moment, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and sped away. As I drove, I kept watching my rearview mirror, but the truck never appeared again. I honestly can't remember how far I drove, but eventually, I pulled over and tried to compose myself. I had just fired my gun at someone. The weight of that realization was crushing. I called the police from the shoulder of the highway. They asked me to stay where I was and wait. As I sat there on the side of the road, I replayed the incident over and over in my mind. Even though I knew I was right, I was still praying that nobody was hurt. The police arrived, and I explained everything to them. They took my pistol and told me to stay in the car. I felt numb. After about half an hour, I was free to go. Later, I learned the man had also called the police, claiming that I had assaulted him. It turned into a complicated situation, his word against mine. He wasn't hit by my shot, something I was profoundly relieved to hear. Despite what I told the police, there were no charges filed against either of us. The police concluded that there was insufficient evidence to proceed with any criminal case. I was questioned extensively, but in the end it seemed like a stalemate. I had been prepared to defend myself, but I never imagined that I would be in a situation where I had to use my gun. In my opinion, the guy in the truck was trying to rob me. That's what I think, because there was no reason for him to do what he did. Before we stopped, I wasn't driving like a jerk, and I didn't do anything to him. There simply isn't any other explanation for it. Although it was a tough experience, I'm glad to put it behind me. The reality is that it could have gone much worse. I don't even want to think about what could have happened if I hit him. I may have lost my freedom for a long time. Also, I could have been charged for discharging my firearm where I did. It was definitely illegal to do that in that area. They let me off, though, because of self-defense. I was only a little over an hour from my town, so I'm worried that I'll run into the man in the truck again sometime, but that hasn't happened yet. It's been just over a year, so it's still possible. About 10 years ago, I was driving trucks for a living, not long haul or anything. I never did overnight jobs. It was just a box truck with no sleeper cab. The job was mostly long, lonely hours on the road, but I didn't mind. It was a rainy, overcast day, and I was driving along a remote highway through farmland. The sound of the rain on the truck's roof was almost hypnotic, and the road ahead was a blur of asphalt in gray skies. I was starting to feel tired, even though it was only late afternoon, so I was thinking about stopping for coffee at the next service station. My rig for the day was an older truck that belonged to my company. It was in good shape, but it had some quirks. The gears were sticky, for lack of a better word. It took some getting used to, and only a few guys at my work could drive this particular truck. I was one of them, and my boss was one of the others. I kept driving, knowing that the nearest stop was over an hour away to the left on the highway. There was a car in a shallow ditch. It didn't look badly damaged, but it was definitely stuck. I slowed down, thinking somebody might need help. It wasn't uncommon for city drivers to misjudge the slick rural roads, especially in bad weather. I pulled my truck over to the shoulder and climbed out. The rain had eased up a little. It was barely even a mist. I stepped off the road into the ditch where the car was. I peered through the windows, but didn't see anyone inside. The car was empty, its engine off, and there was little to no damage. There was a large dent in the side, but it seemed to have come from something else. I walked around the vehicle, checking for any sign of the driver. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see a man approaching. He was wet, his clothes sticking to him, and he looked a bit disheveled. The man explained that it was his car, and then told me he had lost control and ended up in the ditch. He'd been trying to flag down help for the last hour. He seemed harmless enough, just a guy who had a bit of bad luck. "I can give you a lift to the next town or the next service station," I offered. "My cell phone doesn't have service out here, but we can call for a tow from there." He seemed relieved and thanked me. We walked back to my truck, the rain still misting a little. I climbed into the driver's seat, and he got into the passenger side. I know it's not smart to pick up strangers, but it's something I had done for a long time at that point, mostly because of the loneliness from being on the road. Maybe it's also because I feel a duty to help. Because of that, I didn't hesitate to give the guy a ride. As soon as we set off, the man started making me uncomfortable. I felt like he was looking at me, but whenever I turned to him, he turned away. We weren't talking at all. I tried to start a conversation, but he answered all my questions with a single word, or at most two. It was awkward, and I wished I hadn't offered him a ride. About 20 minutes into our drive, the man suddenly pulled a knife and pointed it at me. I swerved the truck out of shock, but managed to keep it on the road. "Pull over and get out," he ordered, his voice cold and steady. I had heard about highway robberies, but I never thought I would be a victim. Like I said, I picked up people before and never had any problems. The man was holding the knife out but keeping it a fair distance from me. I didn't get out right away, I guess, because I was still in shock. He moved in closer, though, and that was when I unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the door. As soon as I was out, he slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. I stood in the rain, watching helplessly as he tried to drive away, but he struggled with the gears. My truck was a bit tricky to drive, and he couldn't seem to figure it out. After a few attempts, he gave up. I could hear muffled cursing from the cab. After no more than 5 minutes, he got out of the truck and sprinted into the nearby field, disappearing into the rain and the rows of canola. I stood there for a few minutes, and then, when I was sure he was gone, I climbed back into the truck, locking the doors behind me. To my relief, the keys were still in the ignition. I was worried that he would have taken them or thrown them away, but he wasn't that smart. I continued down the highway until I finally got a cell signal and called the police. They told me they would search the area and look into the abandoned car in the ditch. I never went back to the spot where the car was, but I did wait for the police at the nearest rest stop. When I talked to them, I found out that the car in the ditch was stolen and my description of the man matched the suspect. I headed out after that and finished my day of work. The police called me a few days later, and I was told the man was caught wandering aimlessly through one of the canola fields next to the highway. Since the evidence was pretty clear, they didn't need anything else from me. I never found out exactly what happened to the man, but I think he did time in prison for stealing the two vehicles. After this happened, I didn't pick up any strangers for a while, at least a year, but eventually I went back to old habits. I try to be a better judge of character, though, and never had a problem since. It was the year 2004, and I was working as a taxi driver. It was a job that suited me well. I liked the independence, but if you look it up, it's actually one of the most dangerous jobs. Lots of things happened to me in the 5 years that I did the job, and this is one of the worst. It was late on a Thursday evening, and business was slower than usual. I was hanging around a local college, hoping to pick up a fare. There was a spot near the front where the taxis would wait. That's how we did things back then. There were 2 cars ahead of me in the queue, but eventually they took off. That's when a young man jumped into my back seat. He was a normal-looking college kid with a hood pulled over his head, obscuring most of his face. There was something about him that immediately struck me as odd, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't his appearance, but the way he was acting. Once he was in my back seat, he gave me the address. The kid didn't say a single word, though he passed me a slip of paper with the address written on it. That had never happened to me before, so I felt weird. It was for a house located almost 45 minutes away in a more remote part of the city. I nodded at him and started the journey. I knew the area where he wanted to go because a lot of people lived in that neighborhood. It was a popular destination, especially late at night. I shifted my car into gear and began driving. The guy didn't say a single word the whole time, but I could feel his eyes on me in the rearview mirror. It was unsettling, the way he just stared, weirdly blinking. I tried to make small talk just to break the tension, but he didn't respond. Not a word. We were about halfway to the house at the moment. We were driving down a small highway. I'd been down that road many times before, and it was one of the darker, more remote areas of the city. There were streetlights, but there weren't enough of them, and it wasn't a very well-developed area. There were some farms around there, but no houses or businesses close by. Suddenly, the man spoke up for the first time since getting into my car. "Pull over here," he said. I was taken aback by his request. We were in the middle of nowhere, and his destination was still a good distance away. "Are you sure?" I asked. "There's nothing around here," I added. "Just pull over," he insisted. I didn't want him to get mad, so I reluctantly complied, pulling the car under the shoulder of the highway. I thought maybe he was going to be sick. This guy didn't look drunk or anything, but who knows? I'd had people puke in my car before, and it's the last thing I wanted, so I decided to pull over. The car's headlights hit a small patch of the road in front of us, but beyond that, it was darkness. I expected my passenger to get out right away, but he didn't move. Before I could ask him what was going on, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. Another car pulled up behind us, and almost simultaneously, another one appeared, blocking us in front. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. I knew it was a setup. Men got out of both cars, and I realized I was about to be robbed. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. I thought about trying to drive away, but with one car in front and another behind, there was no escape. I did have a gun in my car, but I didn't even try for it. The locked box would have taken at least a few seconds to open, and being outnumbered as I was, I thought it best to leave it. These guys were probably armed, too. They approached quickly, and before I knew it, one of them grabbed my door handle. It was locked, but then the man in the back seat finally moved. He reached forward and unlocked the door, and the man opened it. They demanded whatever money I had, which, at the time, was around $700. I took a lot of cash trips and really should have gone to the bank sooner. I gave it to them, too shocked to do much else. Then they ordered me out of my car. I did that too. I stood there on the side of the road, watching my car speed away. I was alone, miles from anywhere, with no way to call for help. I started walking, hoping to flag down a passing car. It felt so real, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. After about 30 minutes, a car finally stopped. It was a couple heading home from a late movie. They were shocked to find me wandering on the highway and didn't hesitate to help. They gave me a ride to the nearest police station. I was grateful, but after what happened to me, I wouldn't have blamed them if they didn't trust me. At the station, I talked to 2 police officers and described the man, the cars, and everything I could remember. They found my taxi the next day, abandoned in a nearby field only a mile or 2 from where I was robbed. It seemed they knew they couldn't do much with it. My guess is that they stole it simply so I wouldn't be able to get help. Maybe to buy them half an hour or so. The thieves had taken everything of value, but the car was otherwise undamaged. The police dusted it for fingerprints and found a match. They were able to track down the men who robbed me, including the one who initially posed as my passenger. They each got less than a year in prison for what they did to me. That seems light, but that's because I never actually saw a weapon. Whether they were armed, I'll never know for sure, but I was told that if one of them had pulled a gun, the sentence would have been much longer. Also, my car was basically fine, so they got off a little because of that as well. I think something like that should be at least 5 years, but that's just my opinion. I continued driving for a few years after this. Other things happened to me before and after, but this is the only time my car was actually stolen. I was just glad to get it back. This happened about 5 years ago when I was in high school. I lived in a suburb and went to school about 15 minutes away. It was the biggest high school in the area. There were about 2,500 students, and some people came from pretty far away. Therefore, some of my friends ended up being from different parts of our city. My friend Mark lived in a house up in the mountains, quite a bit removed from the rest of us. His family owned a large old house surrounded by dense woods. I used to visit him sometimes. We would hang out, play video games, and sometimes explore the woods. A few of my other friends would head up there roughly once per week. It was about 45 minutes each way, so that's why we didn't visit more often. Other than myself, it was usually Andre and Ben who would go to Mark's place. One of us would drive each time, and the others would pitch in for gas. It was usually me driving because my parents would always let me take the car, and they didn't care when I brought it back. On a Friday night, the 3 of us headed up to Mark's house. Mark's parents were away, so we got to have the place to ourselves. I was driving, but the others were having some drinks. While we sat on Mark's back deck, the sky was clear and the moon was full, so we were all enjoying the view of the sky from Mark's patio. That was one of my favorite things about going up there. The stars just aren't the same in my neighborhood, with all the street lights and other houses. It was way past midnight when we finally decided to head home. Ben had a little too much to drink and passed out, so Mark let him stay the night. Andre still wanted to head home, though, so we said goodbye to Mark and left his house. We got into my car and drove down the mountain road. Andre had been drinking but was still pretty much sober. We were talking as the car descended the winding gravel road. I took it slow, as I always did, even though it wasn't that dark. My headlights, combined with the full moon, meant I could see pretty far ahead. I turned a sharp corner and saw a man standing on the road. He was waving his arms wildly. I slammed on the brakes because he was blocking me. It was unusual, especially in such a remote area at this hour. We knew most of Mark's neighbors, and there weren't many of them. This guy definitely wasn't one of them. The guy was in his early 20s, He had a beard and was a little overweight. He looked clean, though, not like somebody who had been out in the woods for any significant amount of time. When I stopped the car in front of the man, he ran to the side of my car. I cracked the window open, slightly wary of the stranger. He seemed panicked and pleaded for a ride to the nearest town, saying he'd gotten lost in the woods and been wandering for hours. Something about his story didn't sit right with me, but the fear in his eyes seemed genuine as far as I could tell. I looked at Andre, who was in the passenger seat. He raised his eyebrows and shrugged as if he didn't know what to do. It was my car, after all, so it was my decision to make. "I'm sorry, but I can't help," I told the man. "I can call for help as soon as I get into town," I added. After I told him that, the man seemed to change his story. He rambled on about somebody chasing him in the woods. I asked why he didn't say that before, but he didn't have an answer. The whole thing was beyond creepy. I just didn't trust this guy, and I sure wasn't letting him into my car. There was no service on that road, so I couldn't call for help until we got down the mountain. As I began to roll up the window and drive away, he dropped to his knees, his hands clasped as if he were praying. It was a distressing sight, but I kept going. I accelerated slowly, glancing in my rearview mirror. That's when I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Another man stepped out from the shadows of the woods, watching my car. He didn't rush to the first man's aid or show any concern. Instead, he stood there, eerily calm, just observing. I slowed my car even more because I was curious. We watched in the back window as the first man got up off his knees, and the two of them walked off the road and out of sight. It didn't look like either of them hurt the other, so I thought they were together in some way. My first thought was that it was a trap. I pressed on the gas harder, putting distance between my car and the two men. Andre and I talked for the next 10 or 20 minutes. We discussed what might have happened if we'd given the first man a ride. Maybe the other man would have jumped out and robbed us. That's all we could think of. I kept checking my mirrors until the road straightened out, and the woods gave way to open fields, and eventually houses and streetlights. As soon as we had cell service, Andre called the police. As I listened to him explaining what happened, I knew how ridiculous it sounded, even still. Andre told me they were sending officers to check it out. When I finally got home, my parents were asleep, and I wished they were around to hear what happened. I went to bed but hardly slept. In the following days, we never heard anything from the police. I knew it was a long shot, but I hoped they would find something out there. Those men would have had plenty of time to hide or get out of there before the cops came. Also, how could the cops have ever proved who it was, even if they found them? All they would have had to do was deny it. I didn't see any car nearby, but it would have been easy to hide one in the bushes off the side of the road. I've had some time to think about it, and the only thing that makes sense is that it was a trap. There's no doubt in my mind that we would have been robbed or killed if I'd let that first man into my car.